Welcome to Module 3 Rich Content. This is a short podcast video and we'll look at Introduction to Multimedia and some learning principles, and then we'll look at the crucial 7 design principles that one can use when creating some or any kind of multimedia content. It can even be a PowerPoint or a podcast like this. The information provided in this video comes mainly from Clark and Meyer, 2008. The book is called E-Learning and the Science of Instruction, and it has become a classic in this world. It is very cognitive, and but I think still, when one designs e-learning, this is still the book to get. So those of you who want to go deeper into this field of study and to help you, this is really a good book to get. Before we continue, I want to ask you an interesting question, and this is just to indicate that the quest for using e-learning or blended learning wasn't invented yesterday. So already in 1947, that is a lot of years ago, almost 70 years ago, the United States Army did the first media comparison research. So they wanted to find out if instruction delivered by film, video, resulted in better learning outcomes than traditional or paper-based versions. So they made 3 groups. They randomly assigned one group into 3 groups, and then they tested them. The first group had a film only, basically a narrated demonstration on how to read a micrometer or micrometer, I guess. The second group was taught in the classroom with exactly the same script as the film and with demonstration, a real-life demonstration. The third group had to do self-study by using a paper lesson. It had the same text as the film, and it had images to describe this whole process. Now I want you to think and tell me which group learned more. Did you vote? Did you think about it? The interesting thing is that it wasn't proven that any of the 3 was necessarily better than the others. And we can just read this quote together because it talks about the evidence. Overwhelming evidence has shown that learning in an online environment can be as effective as that in the traditional classrooms. Students in well-designed and well-implemented online courses learn significantly more and more effectively than those in online courses where teaching and learning activities were not carefully planned. That is also quoted in Clark and Meyer. So where does this lead us to? I think it points us in the direction of understanding what is, as we've already said, would be the best vehicle for your course, for your curriculum, and looking back to Module 1's processes, the matrix and that lesson planner, is the thing that makes the difference, not necessarily introducing a specific new tool. Next we'll look at the learning process. What is learning? This is a very deep question and one that cannot be answered easily, but we look at Clark and Meyer's definition. They say learning is a change in the learner's knowledge due to experience. So let's break that down a bit. Firstly, learning involves change. That change can be in behavior, knowledge, in different things. The change is in what the learner knows. And that change in what the learner knows is caused by the learner's experience. So this basically tries to get away from the idea that learners are empty vessels that you just have to pour in the knowledge. Now I'm going to give you a wonderful quote. Let's read it together. If you are involved in e-training, so we could say blended learning, your task is to design environments that create experiences that will foster desired change in learners' behaviors. So now we are thinking broadly about what are we designing. We're not designing information or knowledge. We are designing environments, and the environment can be the classroom, can be the Moodle virtual site, could be an environment online, in a blog, through this video, etc. That is the environments we are creating, and that is what can change the learners' behaviors because they change, because they are engaged, because they are activated and take part in that process. Coupled with that, it's important to understand how this knowledge that we need to have the student experience through is basically constructed. And for that we turn to these three principles of knowledge construction, also taken from Clark and Meyer. And I'll quickly run through them. It's basically, the first one is, remember, there are dual channels. The second is, those dual channels have limited capacity, and learning is importantly occurs when people are actively, and learners are actively processing whatever they are doing. Let's have a look at each of these three principles. First principle, dual channels. There are visual, pictorial, as well as auditory or verbal channels. So, in the picture at the top, we see an eye. That is the visual or pictorial channel of sensory information, and basically the blue line indicates how the information flows through the eyes into the learner's brain. The bottom one is the channel for auditory or verbal. So visual might be images the person sees, or it might be words that is read. Those are both examples of visual or pictorial. Auditory would be anything that people hear, sound, music, or narration. The second principle builds on the first. Each of these channels has limited capacity and can process only a few pieces of information in each of these channels at any one time. So you can see in the visual channel, there will be overload. It's too many inputs at the same time. The bottom one has only one good input, and that will be great. The third principle is then, once a learner has received in the correct way from these channels the information or the sensory markers, there must be active processing. Learning occurs when people engage in appropriate cognitive processing during learning. And the appropriateness comes from having relevant material. We'll see later on how doing away with redundant external information or visuals or even music can be harmful. Organizing material in coherent structures, which is something we've been saying a lot. Sometimes it's very simple just to look at structure. And very importantly, learner has to integrate whatever he or she is learning, has to integrate that with existing knowledge. So it's not knowledge poured in, it is constructivist in nature, cognitive constructivist, because it builds on previous knowledge structures, etc., and it gets blended there. It is helpful to understand what we've just heard about the channels and about this process of active processing to understand how the theory of multimedia learning works. Now there are different theories, but as I've said, Meyer and Clark and their theory of the cognitive theory of multimedia learning is quite powerful and still very prevalent and very useful, I think, to understand what we are doing when we are designing. So if we look at this image, you will see there are basically 4 blocks. The first block is multimedia presentation. The second block is about the senses. Third, working memory, and the fourth, long-term memory. And this shows the flow of information and in the process of learning. Under multimedia presentation, we see it can be words or pictures. Words can be spoken, and therefore they go through the ears, that is the auditory channel, or they can be written, and then it goes through the eyes, the visual channel. Pictures go through the visual channel, through the eyes. Then the first important process happens. The brain selects, so the sensory input gets selected, the words and the images, and then the working memory kicks in. Sounds are organized, images are organized, words are organized into a verbal model, into a pictorial model. And then comes a very interesting thing that we've said, the active processing also incorporates prior knowledge of the student, and this third important part is now integrating whatever is come as new inputs, integrating that with prior knowledge. And this is how it all works. So basically we'll see later on when there's too much input through the ears or through the eyes, as we've said with the dual channel limited capacity, the selection becomes muzzled, the organization becomes muzzled in working memory, and integrating cannot take place. And if there is no, if the relevance isn't as such, and if the environment has been created as such that it builds or brings in at least a context and prior knowledge, then the learning will also suffer. That is the multimedia learning theory of Clark and Meyer. Next, we'll be focusing on the 7 principles for multimedia design. Now, there's a lot of them, and the words are quite difficult, but I think it's actually very, very useful for us to understand a little bit, maybe not in depth, but a little bit about each of these 7 principles. And I'll just read them quickly, and then we'll go into detail on each of them. First one, multimedia. Use words and graphics rather than words alone. The second one is contiguity. It's important to align words to corresponding graphics. Third, modality. Present words as audio narration rather than on-screen text. Fourth, redundancy. Explain visuals with words in audio or text, but not in both. Coherence is fifth. Adding extra material can hurt learning. 6 is personalization. It's important to use conversational style and virtual coaches when you design your own materials. And the last one, segmenting and pre-training. Managing complexity by breaking a lesson into parts. This is one that I think has become sort of very well known, is the whole idea of chunking, especially when it comes to online learning. So let's have a look at each one of these principles in detail. First is the multimedia one. Use words and graphics rather than words alone. So it basically means that it is good to use images. That's basically what it boils down to. And it's scientifically proven, according to Clark and Meyer, that if students get provided only with words, only with text, as opposed to words and images, that's integrated, the learning is much better. Principle number 2, contiguity. Align words to corresponding graphics. And this is important for writing a report, doing a PowerPoint, or making an e-lesson. And it's very easy, simple actually to understand. So on the left-hand side is a representation of where, let's say, at the top of the page it would be talking about this image, but the image only follows later on, maybe on a second page where you have to turn around, or at the page, or lower down on a page where you have to scroll. So basically, on the right-hand side, you can see I've written there, as we can see in this graph, the introduction to the graph, to the image, and the image is in close proximity to each other. And the closest they can be to each other, the better. This is quite helpful. The third principle is modality. And this is interesting because the use of sound, the personal voice, I think makes a difference. I believe that really. It says present words as audio narration rather than on-screen text. Obviously, at certain times one wouldn't have audio, and you would just have students read through things. But if you can add audio, especially audio narration, then rather than on-screen text, it really makes a difference. It increases the learning potential. Fourth principle, redundancy. It says explain visuals with words in audio or text, not in both. So in the left-hand example, you can see there's the image, there's the text, and there would be narration. So we have the audio and the words describing the picture. On the right-hand side, we have only the audio describing the picture. And that is basically these dual channels, because if you read the words with your eyes and look at the picture with your eyes, you have there's a bit of a cognitive overload, and then through the ears you hear the sound. On the right hand side you have the eyes looking at the picture and the ears listening at the audio. Fifth one is coherence. Adding extra material can hurt learning. This is quite an important one, and one I think that one can is in the danger of doing. This basically says keep to the core stuff. If you want to prove that your thing is good, you don't necessarily have to add a lot of extra things. And this, for example, the examples I give here is, let's say the core is around this image in the middle, around this graph, around this specific research or whatever. For example, left hand top, now we add a picture of an apple because let's say the research was about apples and the apple being bitten. It's nice, it creates an atmosphere, but it's unnecessary for learning. On the left hand bottom we've got a video. Now all of a sudden we have a little video that shows the import of apples on a container ship. Very interesting to create context, etc., but not crucial to understanding this part of the lecture or of the lesson. Right hand top, we've got a very detailed graph on occupations, how it's influenced by this growth in the soft fruit industry. And then the right hand side we've got a whole extra text that students that's in the eye of the students. So basically cut out anything that isn't necessary for the core part of what you want students to pay attention to process in their working memory and to integrate it. Otherwise it creates cognitive overload. Then one that I like, 6, personalization. Use conversational style and virtual coaches. It's actually quite easy. First of all, try and speak as if you are talking to a real people on the other side. So it's a conversation. So hopefully I've demonstrated this now with this podcast, is to create a easy style where I talk about my practice, what I think. I talk about your practice, how you can use it, maybe through examples, etc. Sometimes just using words like I, you, us, we, or saying hello, or saying please consider doing this, etc. It makes a huge difference, and that's proven through the science. And you can see there's a little picture of me, and they say that a bit of the author should shine through the script, should shine through this lesson. Now obviously everything can be done too much, so we don't want something like, hey bros, this is so great that you guys are joining my course and it's going to be cool and we're just going to have fun. That's obviously wrong. So it's about the balance, but bring in some humanness, bring in a little bit of humor and this personalization. The last one is segmenting and pre-training. We can manage complexity by breaking a lesson into parts, especially if it's a very large and complex piece of work or a whole module that you need to be having students experience. And that's just a way of doing that. Break it into smaller chunks, create the flow between the chunks, and the retention and the engagement and less cognitive overload is the result of all of this. So those are the 7 principles of multimedia. And so we've learned about Clark and Meyer, we've learned about the process of learning, the multimedia theory of learning, and then we went through the 7 principles of multimedia design. And the last thing for us to do is to go out and to design beautiful experiences for our students.